Hello, I'm Glenna Manning, the pastor of discipleship at Concord United Methodist, and it's my joy to welcome you to a new study today on Paul's letter to the Romans. Paul's letter to the Romans cannot be done in one study. The scholars have spent years and years studying all of Paul's works, and Romans is a masterful piece. It is considered to be one of the most creative and deepest masterpieces that Paul did of all of his letters that he wrote. So we're going to be looking through the whole book, but we'll be focusing on particularly one particular element of it, and that is about God's grace. In order to proceed through this study, I'm going to use the help of several authors and scholars, but I'm so glad that you're here to join me today. And if you've not done so already, I invite you to get your Bibles handy. If you're currently in the church in which I'm a pastor and you need any of the handouts that come with this, if you're in my class, they'll be uploaded to you automatically. But if you're not in my class and would like to receive them, please do not hesitate to send me an email at gmanning@concordunited.org and let me know what you need, and I'll be happy to send those out to you. And so as we proceed today, I want to go on into our PowerPoint as we talk about this wonderful book. And like I said, we could spend, probably several years looking at it in depth. So to move into it today, this one is going to be called In the Grip of Grace. And it's based upon a book ultimately by Max Lucado. Now, as I like to do when we start books or start new studies, if I'm using different authors, I'd like to let you know a little bit about them. And we begin with Max Lucado. Now, if you've spent any time in studying Christian works, this is not a foreign name to you. Max Lucado has been a prolific writer, a wonderful author, teacher, pastor, and he goes by this mission statement: to overflow to others the grace and encouragement which has been lavished on himself by God. When Max tells his autobiography, we will learn from him that he grew up in Texas as the son of an oil field mechanic and a nurse. And he was brought up in the church, but at some point he decided to leave that and go his own way. But he would tell us that one night after downing a six-pack of a beer, he wondered if there wasn't more to life than parties and chasing pretty girls. And he would come into a Bible study at nearby Abilene Christian University, and that would be a life-changing experience for him. He would go on to West Texas and get a master's degree in biblical studies and a desire to share God's love. And he would start doing that by planting churches in Rio de Janeiro, and then settling in Florida where he met his wife, and they've been married all these many years. Like I said, he has been very passionate about ministry and about expanding the news to others. And so it seems only fitting that his book, In the Grip of Grace, is what we'll be using. Now, I will tell you, and I'll show you a picture of the book that I'm speaking of. It has several covers to it. It's been printed first in 1996, and then it's been reprinted several times. And most recently, and something that we're going to be using toward the end of each week's study, is a new text by Lucado that has to go along with this first book. It is called It's Just 40 Days Through the Book. And what he invites us to do, based upon the reading and the other, but to actually pause and spend some time looking at different sections of the book. And so you'll hear more about that as we move along. I'm going to use a series of commentaries, and two of the major voices that I'll be listening to as we go into this. One is N.T. Wright. N.T. Wright has written the text for the New Interpreter's Commentary series, and he is an English New Testament scholar. He is a Pauline theologian and an Anglican bishop. He was the Bishop of Durham from 2003 to 2010, and then he became a research professor at New Testament and Early Christianity at St. Mary's College in the University of St. Andrews in Scotland until 2019, when he became a senior research fellow at Wycliffe College at the University of Oxford. He is a very well noted, deep scholar, and he's probably spent a lifetime studying Paul's work, and particularly in looking at this letter to Romans. Another theologian that we'll be looking at is Luke Timothy Johnson. He has written a book about New Testament writings, and he is a New Testament scholar and historian of early Christianity. He is the Robert W. Woodward Professor of New Testament and Christian Origins at Candler School of Theology and a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University. So, as you can tell, these people know a whole lot more about Paul than I will ever claim to know. But we are going to begin this study looking at, like I said, just a beautiful section of it as we really focus on this idea of God's grace. One of the things you will find is that a lot of people like to talk about our sinfulness, our waywardness, and what Paul in his writing wants us to always come back to is our salvation, or known as grace. And so that will kind of give us an introduction to our study. As we move into it, like I've said before, it's considered to be one of Paul's greatest works. It's been read and studied by many theologians who've taken nuggets of truth and expanded on them and explained them critically, but it's also at times been a very misunderstood text. If you try to pull just a statement or a sentence out of it or a fragment of a paragraph, you will lose a piece of it because Paul's work start with a statement and go deeper and deeper and deeper, and that morphs into another statement that goes deeper and deeper and deeper. And so at times it's a challenge to read this particular letter. Paul can write with paragraphs, type sentences that will keep you going and going, and sometimes repeating the same word several times within the same sentence. So you have to really pause and savor and think about what it is that he is expressing. N.T. Wright, when he writes about this in the commentary, he begins by making this work about Romans an analogy to an alpine mountain climber. He said, when people climb an alpine mountain and look down upon the village, they're going to get a different view depending upon the path that they took to get there and what they can see. And no matter how many people climb that mountain, very few are going to climb it in the very same way and look at it and see the very same view of it. And at times, one view will come clearly to you, and at times, another view. And so it's always worth climbing it over and over again. And I thought that was a great analogy. So we're always going to be looking at it from different angles and different perspectives and really different places in our own faith walk. As when we move into talking about this, one of the things that most scholarship agrees upon is that this letter was written sometime in the mid 50s of the first century. They believe it was written from the city of Corinth or somewhere nearby there. It was written apparently while he was planning a final voyage to Jerusalem, and with the intention he was going on to Rome, and then he was going on to Spain. Now, what's important about that, you remember that Paul was a missionary, and as a missionary, he depended upon the benevolence of many Jews and Jewish Christians in order to enable him to take these trips. He was writing this letter, and we don't exactly know why yet, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But by going by way of Jerusalem, he was going to get some funds, if you will, in order for him to travel on to Rome and then on to Spain. We don't really know exactly his death. They believed that he died in Rome, possibly under, he was martyred under Emperor Nero, who would have been there about the time that he was heading into Rome. And so he never made it to Spain. Why he wrote the letter is considered to be sort of a great mystery because you can tell all kinds of things within the letter. Unlike Paul's other letters, when he writes to the church in Corinth or to the other churches of which he wrote letters, he was familiar with these churches. As far as we know, Paul had never been to the churches in Rome. He didn't plant them, and so he didn't really have any instruction over them. Like the other letters, we always say that when we read Paul's letter, it's like we look over his shoulder and we look at them, but we really don't know what precipitated for him to write the letter. But oftentimes in these early letters, it was because there was a problem or there was a crisis or there was something that he needed to tell the people. Sometimes these letters were written to churches and sometimes they were written to academic communities that they might go out and tell. But there's, kind of speculation as well, why was he writing to the people at Rome? But one of the major themes that is unveiled in the book of Romans is about God's righteousness. Now, righteousness means to be made right. How are we being made right with God? And the difficulty, like I said, in reading this book is you can't just pick apart and find a few good lines and that'll be the synopsis of the whole book or the whole chapter. With Paul, it all kind of blends together. But he unpacks them very carefully. And sometimes he circles back to previous ideas. So he gives you something, almost presents arguments for it, steps away from it, and then comes back into it another time. But when we talk about righteousness, we always think about right, and maybe think about the legal scales that we often use to symbolize righteousness being made even. But Paul wants us to see that God's righteousness is not like world righteousness. It is not seen in that normal sense that we see in the imperial justices of the current people at the time or the current people of this time. Paul is speaking about restorative justice, where humankind is redeemed and restored into right relationship with God. What does that particularly look like? Now, when we look at a historical perspective of what was going on in this particular time, we know that what he was trying to teach was restorative, not punitive. And what I mean by that is, let's say that someone, I'll call him John. John came and he burned my house to the ground. In our time of legalistic system, I would go after punitive damages from John. I want John to replace the value of my home. But even in doing that, he cannot restore everything that I lost in the burning of my home. He might be in prison. He might have to pay fines and reimburse me dollar amounts for that. But it fully never restores me to back what I was originally, because there'll be heirlooms and things that cannot be replaced. Well, when we talk about restorative justice in terms of living in right relationship with God, it means that God claims us, redeems us, restores us to our original origin, what it was that God wanted from us to begin with, which was to be in right relationship with Him. Now, if we look at what was going on in the culture at the particular time that Paul was most likely writing this letter, um, we're talking about Jewish Christians and Christian Gentiles. You'll recall that the earliest Christians were converts from Judaism. And in time, they would also, in what Christ would invite into this, are Gentiles, because they too were going to be a part of God's inclusive family. And so we had these early Jewish Christians out there, and then we had Christian Gentiles, those who were not of the Jewish faith, but Gentiles. And so there were often clashes amongst them, because Jewish Christians did not understand why Christian Gentiles did not have to obey all the same covenant restrictions and laws that they had grown up with. And so, what you're talking about is thousands of years tradition, how they celebrated their festivals, what their diets were, what the how they kept the covenant, the laws that went with it, all the Levitical laws that they had to do. And along come the Gentiles who've not been raised in that particular tradition, and they're being told, well, no, you don't have to be circumcised. No, you don't have to eat all those certain foods. No, you don't have to bring these certain offerings to the temple anymore. And so you begin to see the conflict that's arising. And so they're trying to figure out, as Jewish Christians, how do we follow Christ and stay with the covenant that we thought we had made with God, and at the same time invite these new Gentiles in? Now, what had happened was, sometime in the 40s of the first century, there was an edict by Emperor Claudius to expel a lot of the Jewish population. And they believe this is because there had been a riot between these espousing Jewish Christians and and Christian Gentiles. And so they were in this uneasy coexistence. And sometimes they had been sent out because Christians were still trying to proselytize to Jews who were not yet Jewish Christians. So there was a lot of conflict going on around this religious air. So the emperor took care of it by just dispelling all the Jewish population. So, well, this will take care of the situation. You all won't be in conflict with each other. But in the 54, Emperor Nero rescinded the decree, and the Jewish people came back. The dissension, though, had not gone away. There was an underlying problem with coexistence. Jewish Christians wanting to keep with the law, Gentile Christians saying they did not have to. Now, as I told you, Paul now has a difficult walk. Paul needs the financial resources of the Jewish people. He does not want to ostracize any of them. He basically doesn't want to take sides. He sees that God's work is in the midst of both of them. And so he's writing this huge epistle, this huge letter, trying to appease both sides and to get them to live in harmony with one another as they prepare for his coming there. because he would tell them this in the very first chapter of the book of Romans. He's come into Rome with a gospel that says God's power for salvation to the Jews first and also to the Greek, who were these early Gentile Christians. So he's saying, this is for everyone. I want to prepare you to do them. So, in order to speak to them, Paul has to get to the roots of Jewish foundational principles and Christian foundational principles, Christian thinking. How do we get through to the covenant, to the Torah, to faithfulness and unfaithfulness, and how Jesus' death and resurrection was a solution to the problems that existed between them? Now, many people have written outlines of this, and they're all a little bit different. I've just chosen to bring to you the one from N.T. Wright. He divides the book of Romans like this. He said in Romans 1 through 4, he is speaking to the faithfulness of God. So he's basically speaking to the Jewish population. Can you remember how God has always been faithful to you, how he's gone before you, and what he has done for you as a human people? In 5 through 8, we start this shift to seeing God's people in Christ as the true humanity. That's this inclusive nature that comes around. Then from 9 to 11, we back up. Like I said, we talked again about God's faithfulness and God's promises, but now in light of in welcoming these new believers into the faith. And then it ends with, at the end of the day, it's all about how to worship God, God's holiness, and unity based around the word. So we'll kind of stick to that a little bit, but those are kind of the major topics that at the end of the day, we really want to talk about. How does God make things right with humanity? How does one live in relationship with humanity? And how does one come to accept the grace that God has given us in order to do so? Now, in order to start this understanding of this, Lucado has written what I think is an awesome parable. It's called the Parable of the River. And so he tells this story in his book, In the Grip of Grace. Like I said, if you are in my class, I've already sent you this as a PDF. If you're not in my class and you would like to have this in written form, like I said, if you'll email me, I'll be sure and send it to you. But there's really no way to encapsulate this in just a few words. And so for the purposes of this lesson, I want to read this story to you. It is called the Parable of the River. And maybe you can find a way to identify yourself in this parable. Once there were 5 sons who lived in a mountain castle with their father. The eldest was an obedient son, but his 4 younger brothers were rebellious. Their father had warned them of the river, but they had not listened. He had begged them to stay clear of the bank lest they be swept downstream, but the river's lure was too strong. Each day, the 4 rebellious brothers ventured closer and closer until one son declared and dared to reach in and fill the waters. Hold my hand so I won't fall in, he said, and his brothers did. But when he touched the water, the current yanked him and the other 3 into the rapids and rolled them down the river. Over the rocks they bounced. Through channels they roared. On the swells they rode. Their cries for help were lost in the rage of the river. Though they fought to gain their balance, they were powerless against the strength of the current. After hours of struggle, they surrendered to the pull of the river. The waters finally dumped them on the bank in a strange land, in a distant country, in a barren place. Savage people dwelt in the land. It was not safe like their home. Cold winds chilled the land. It was not warm like their home. Rugged mountains marked the land. It was not inviting like their home. Though they did not know where they were, one fact was sure. They were not intended for this place. For a long time, the 4 young sons lay on the bank, stunned at their fall and not knowing where to turn. After some time, they gathered their courage and re-entered the waters, hoping to walk upstream, but the current was too strong. They attempted to walk along the river's edge, but the terrain was too steep. They considered climbing the mountains, but the peaks were too high. Besides, they didn't know the way. Finally, they built a fire and sat down. We shouldn't have disobeyed our father, they admitted. We are a long way from home. With the passage of time, the sons learned to survive in the strange land. They found nuts for food and killed animals for skins. They determined not to forget their homeland nor abandon hopes of returning. Each day they set about the task of finding food and building shelter. Each evening they built a fire and told stories of their father and older brother. All four sons longed to see them again. Then one night one brother failed to come to the fire. The others found him in the next morning in the valley with the savages. He was building a hut of grass and mud. I've grown tired of our talks, he told them. What good does it do to remember? Besides, this isn't too bad. I will build a great house and settle here. But it isn't home, they objected. No, but it is if you don't think of the real one. But what of father? What of him? He isn't here. He isn't near. Am I to spend forever awaiting his arrival? I'm making new friends. I'm learning new ways. If he comes, but I'm not holding my breath. And so the other three left their hut building brother and walked away. They continued to meet around the fire, speaking of home and dreaming of their return. Some days later, a second brother failed to appear at the campfire. The next morning, his siblings found him on a hillside staring at the hut of his brother. How disgusting, he told them as they approached. Our brother is an utter failure, an insult to our family name. Can you imagine a more despicable deed? Building a hut and forgetting our father? What he's doing is wrong, agreed the youngest, but what we did was wrong as well. We disobeyed. We touched the river. We ignored our father's warnings. Well, we may have made a mistake or two, but compared to the sleaze in the hut, we are saints. Father will dismiss our sin and punish him. Come, return to the fire with us. No, I think I'll keep an eye on our brother. Someone needs to keep a record of his wrongs to show father. And so the two returned, leaving one brother building and the other brother judging. The two remaining sons stayed near the fire, encouraging each other and speaking of home. Then one morning, the youngest son awoke to find he was alone. He searched for his brother and found him in the river stacking rocks. It's no use, the rock stacking brother explained as he worked. Father won't come to me, so I must go to him. I've offended him. I've insulted him. I've failed him. There's only one option. I'll build a path back up the river and walk into our Father's presence. Rock upon rock, I will stack until I have enough rocks to travel upstream to the castle. When he sees how hard I've worked and how diligent I have been, he will have no choice but to open the door and let me into his house. The last brother did not know what to say. He returned to sit by the fire alone. One morning he heard a familiar voice behind him. Father has sent me to bring you home. The youngest lifted his eyes to see the face of his oldest brother. You've come for us, he shouted, and for a long time the two embraced. And your brothers? The eldest finally asked. One has made a home here, another is watching him, and the third is building a path up to the river. So the firstborn set out to find the siblings. He went to the thatched hut. Go away, stranger, screamed the brother through the window. You're not welcome here. But I've come to take you home. You have not. You've come to take my mansion. This is no mansion. This is a hut. It is a mansion, the finest in the lowlands. I built it with my own hands. Now go away. You can't have my mansion. Don't you remember your father's house? I have no father. You were born in a castle in a distant land where the air is warm and the fruit is plentiful. You disobeyed your father and ended up in this strange land. I have come to take you home. The brother peered through the window at the firstborn as if recognizing a face he remembered from a dream. But the pause was brief, for suddenly the savages in the house filled the window as away and said, Go away, intruder. This is not your home. You are right, responded the firstborn, but neither is it his. The eyes of the two brothers met again, and once more the hut-building brother felt a tug at his heart. But the savages had won his trust. He just wants your mansion, they cried. Send him away. And so he did. Well, the firstborn sought the next brother. He didn't have to walk far, because on a hillside near the hut, within eyesight of the savages, sat the fault-finding son. When he shouted, he said, How good that you're here to behold the sin of your brother. Are you aware that he turned his back on the castle? Are you aware that he never speaks of home? I knew you would come. I've kept careful accounts of his deeds. Punish him. I will applaud your anger. He deserves it. Deal with the sins of our brother. The firstborn spoke softly. Well, we need to deal with your sins first. My sins? You have disobeyed the Father. You need to stay here. My sins are nothing. There's a sinner, he said, pointing to the hut. Let me tell you the savages who stayed here. I'd rather you tell me about yourself. Don't worry about me. Let me tell you the savages. Don't worry about me. Let me show you the people who need your help. Come, we'll peek in the windows. He never sees me. Let's go together. The son was at the hut before he noticed that the firstborn hadn't followed him. Next, the eldest son walked to the river. There he found the last brother, knee deep in the water, stacking stones. Father has sent me to take you home. The brother never looked up. I can't talk now. I must work. Father knows you have fallen, but he will forgive you. He may, the brother interrupted, struggling to keep his balance against this current, but I have to get to the castle first. I must build a pathway up the river. First, I will show him that I am worthy, and then I will ask for his mercy. He's already given his mercy. I'll carry you up the river, and you'll never be able to build a pathway. The river's too long. The task is too great for your hands. Father sent me to carry you home. I am stronger. For the first time, the rock stacking brother looked up. How dare you speak to me with such irreverence? My father will not simply forgive. I have sinned. I have sinned greatly. He told us to avoid the river, and we disobeyed. I'm a great sinner. I need much work. No, my brother, you don't need much work. You need much grace. The distance between you and our Father's house is too great. You haven't enough strength nor the stones to build a road. That is why our Father has sent me. He wants me to carry you home. Are you saying I can't do it? Are you saying I'm not strong enough? Look at my work. Look at my rocks. Already I can walk 5 steps. But you have 1,000,000 to go. The younger brother says, I know who you are. You're the voice of evil. You're trying to seduce me from my holy work. Get behind me, you serpent. And he threw a rock at the firstborn. Heretic, leave this land. You can't stop me. I'll build this walkway and stand before my father, and he will have to forgive me. I will win his favor. I will earn his mercy. Favor won is no favor. Mercy earned is no mercy. I implore you, let me carry you up the river, said the firstborn. The response, another rock. Well, the youngest brother was waiting near the fire when the firstborn returned. The others didn't come. No, one chose to indulge, the other to judge, and the third to work. None of them chose our Father. So they will remain here. For now, said the oldest brother. And we will return to the Father. Yes, we will. Will he forgive me? Would he have sent me if he wouldn't? And so the younger brother climbed on the back of the firstborn and began the journey home. It's a great story. It's a great story because it shows us the different kinds of people that we can find ourselves being, and we're a composite sometimes of all of them. There is the indulging self, the one who went, built his own place, and said, I'm just going to make do and stay right here. The aim of life is my own pleasure. And we call those hedonists. And if we look in the first chapter of Romans, which we're going to look at in more detail next time, it's about being self-satisfied. That anything that satisfies you is what you're going to spend your time thinking about. Now, in the early parts of polytheism, you saw that many people made things of things that God had created. They made images and idols of birds and reptiles and animals and earthly people, and they worshiped those things instead of worshiping the creator that had created the real thing. It is really the first sin. Do you remember that, they were just going to stay in their own self-pleasure, and they really did not have any need to have God in the midst of that? Self-satisfaction. And unfortunately, many people still are living in that. It's just, I'll just do what I want to do. I'm not interested in pleasing anyone but myself. The second thing that we fall into and we see within the story is the comparing self, or the judgmentalist. And they want to justify everything they're doing by doing a comparison, if you will, always thinking that they are better than the person whom they're talking about. And the problem with that is it's just kind of a sliding scale. And we look for people who have it a little bit better than us so that we can knock them down in the midst of that in order to lift ourselves up. We're much more interested in dealing with what we view as the mistakes of other people than in viewing our own sinfulness, our own mistakes. And did you love that when the eldest brother, he says, well, let me tell you everything he did. And the answer from the eldest brother, well, let's talk about what you did. But he says, well, not I've done is not near as bad. But when we separate ourselves from God, no matter how big or how small it is, it's still a separation from that. And you cannot fuel your goodness by talking about the failures of others, because each of us stand on our own in that. And then the third type of son that we see in this story is the self-saving legalist. He's going to find his own way to salvation by his own works, his own efforts. This is what we would call the Pharisees in the days of Jesus. They did all of these things, but they forgot the spirit of that. And they see sin and they see brokenness, but they're going to try to fix it themselves. He was going to build his way back to God by doing enough good works, enough hard work, proving himself worthy to go there. And so he keeps trying to do good deeds to make himself worthy to be accepted, when grace is all these people need. This is what they need, which is ultimately to entrust themselves to God. And the goal is of our life is to have this relationship with God and to not experience this separation. And it comes down to these terms of godlessness versus godliness, God versus self, a life with God or a life without God. That's what we're talking about here. And we cannot earn our way, pay our way, buy our way, or outwork our way to be good enough to come to God. God has already got us in his grace. He's already got us in his power. And we don't get there, by just focusing on ourselves. We don't get there by standing back and clicking our tongue and pointing our finger at what other people are doing wrong. And we don't get there by saying, if I do enough good stuff, God will love me and invite me into the kingdom. We have to trust that God's grace is strong enough, powerful enough to hold us. And that will be encapsulated into a portion of what Paul is writing. So I told you that each week we'll have some ways that we might grow deeper in the faith. Again, these are on the handout sheet if you want to have a copy of it. And so each day I just ask you to take one of these bullet items and look through them. And so this is really pausing to write, most of the verses are not more than 16 verses of any portion of a chapter. Some are less than that. And once you read that, pause and think about it and then answer maybe these questions. You don't have to write it down. You can write them in your head or you can make a journal of this. And it's how we are keeping with the second part of Lucado's book in this 40-day study as we kind of work our way through it, pausing and reflecting about these issues. So next week we'll return. We're going to be looking specifically at chapters 1 and 2 in Romans, and also looking at some of these hedonistic, legalistic, judgmental people that we see that we've studied already in this parable story. And until that time comes, I hope that you will enjoy delving deeper into the book of Romans, this powerful book with so many truths to it. And so until we meet again next week, may God bless you and keep you. I'll see you then.